Today we're going to be talking about building effective feedback cultures in our learning spaces, whether those are face-to-face classrooms, online classrooms, or hybrid classrooms. This was part of the I Teach MSU series, and I'm going to introduce myself as a way to begin. My name is Bill Hart-Davidson, and I am a faculty member in the Department of Writing, Rhetoric, and American Cultures here at Michigan State University, and I also work in the Dean's Office in the College of Arts and Letters. As my subtitle indicates, today our focus is really on something that sometimes can get backgrounded when we think about designing our courses or designing effective learning for students, and that is the interactions that happen in your classroom. Let me start with an analogy about what I mean. If we think about designing a course, or maybe even designing a lesson in a course, as analogous to designing a piece of music, as composing a piece of music, the content for the course might be the notes on the page. And that's an important part, but we also want to think about other things when we think about composing to make a successful piece. What we're going to be talking about today are everything except the notes. So maybe starting with something like the arrangement. If you're composing for an orchestra, you get to decide which instruments play which pieces. And of course, there's things like tempo and rhythm and all of the dynamics that make a piece of music really successful. So feedback cultures are a little bit about all of those things. We're going to think about what kind of interactions really make for a successful learning experience for students. Here's a little bit of our agenda for the day. I'm going to begin by showing and introducing really a vocabulary for talking about interaction patterns for learning. These are your building blocks. These are probably going to be familiar to you once you see them because you will have used them or experienced them as learners yourselves. But we're going to give them names, and we're going to try to think more deliberately about how we make use of them to create effective learning experiences. We'll also talk a little bit about what happens in certain kinds of interactions that's really valuable for learners. Specifically, we'll focus on feedback and how to make sure that students are getting all the kinds of feedback that they really need. We'll look at a few examples in order to understand, including one that you, again, may have experienced or be familiar with, but you might not know the name of, called Think, Pair, Share, which is an interaction sequence. It puts some of these interaction patterns together and starts to create that kind of symphony that I was talking about. And then we'll transition to a bit of a tool, a device that you might think about as you sit down to design an effective learning experience for your students, whether you're thinking about a single class session or maybe a whole course. And we'll move through this pretty quickly. Each of these slides has a lot of information, and so I recommend that as we go forward, feel free to pause. There are a few times when I'll ask you a question and maybe encourage you to reflect and write some things out. And then as we move through into the design part, you might actually stop, take these ideas into consideration, go retrieve some materials of your own, work on those, and then come back and think about how well these concepts are helping you think about the interactions you want to create in your classroom. So to begin, I'd like to talk about 4 common interaction patterns, and I may add a 5th that somebody suggested to me at one of the times we gave this. We had these conversations in a face-to-face environment. But these are 4 that, once again, that you'll be familiar with. So on the left here on your screen, you'll see what I'll call few-to-few, small group work. In the second position, we have one-to-many. I'll think of this as presentation mode. It might be the instructor at the front of the room, or you might ask students to present their work. The third is many-to-many, which is a large group discussion where you want lots of participation and dialogue to occur among the large group. And then finally, one-to-one or consultation. When you think about these as building blocks, these are options available to you as an instructor to structure a class session, as I mentioned, or maybe even a whole course. And we tend to favor some of these. Sometimes we favor them because we have constraints to deal with. So for example, if you're teaching a large section course where you have a lot of people, it makes some of these kinds of interactions, especially one-to-one, much more challenging because we have the constraint of time. The room you're in may also constrain you. So if you want to do small group work, but you're in a room where the chairs are bolted to the floor and all facing one way, it introduces a bit of a physical constraint on the interaction patterns. So some of those are a bit of a design challenge for us. Other times we just fall into patterns, or we have subject material that seems to lend itself to one pattern or another. And those are both good and bad depending on how deliberate we are and how attentive we are to whether they're working for our students. One other thing I want to bring up, which I have in the little sticky note here, is I frame these interaction patterns in these terms, few to few, one to many, many to many, and one to one, because they're helpful for thinking about both online and face-to-face classrooms or even hybrid environments. And one of the things that happens when we start thinking about them in contrast between, let's say, a digital space, a digital learning environment, or a distance learning environment, and a face-to-face learning environment, is we start to see some differences that really come up with what we take for granted maybe in face-to-face environments. One of those is how quickly and how easily we can switch these interaction patterns on the fly or in an improvisational way in relation to what we see the learners doing. In a digital classroom where we're dealing with folks who are maybe accessing the course asynchronously, maybe they're far apart from one another, switching from one to many, a presentation like we're doing now, where you're watching a video and I am presenting it to some number of people, but you're distributed in time and space. Switching to all of a sudden do a one-to-one takes a fair amount of coordination. And it may not even be possible at all to get to a few-to-few because folks watching this video might not be aware of who else is watching the video. So it helps to give us an understanding of what are the building blocks that we really count on to make effective learning experiences, and if we shift to a digital space, can we retain those? How will I have a few-to-few solution for my chemistry course, let's say, where I really want folks discussing lab results in small groups? If I'm only using one tool, maybe I don't have that in an online space. So that's the usefulness, I think, of having a vocabulary like this. What I'd like you to think about as a way to sort of get used to these concepts are two questions, and maybe you can pause here and write some answers down. So one would be, which is the mode that you find yourself as an instructor relying on the most? And as you think about that, which one of these do you think is the most effective for your students? Once you've thought about that, let me give you one more to ponder. Come at this as a learner. When you're a learner and you're in a formal setting, which of these do you prefer? Which one helps you learn the most? And see if you can offer a few reasons why. So once you've paused and thought about that, feel free to move on. Here are those prompts one more time. Which are most important for you as a learner, as a teacher, as a mentor? We can think about a range of teaching and learning opportunities. So, what were your responses on a typical day in your class? What interaction patterns do you use? Maybe you use more than one. That's pretty common. And in fact, one of the most valuable things about having a vocabulary like this of interactions to mix with the content is that we can start to think about, maybe for 20 minutes I'll have folks do this, and that will help them understand the ideas, and then I'll shift the interaction pattern and have them discuss. What we can do then is we can change up interaction patterns to get different kinds of outcomes. One of the reasons we do that, as we'll see, is we allow students to seek the kind of feedback that they most need at the time that they most need it. As you're thinking through your own experiences as a teacher and as a learner moving through these interaction patterns, here's another way to think and maybe reflect on. Describe a time when the interaction patterns worked out in a way that you thought was a really effective lesson, that you saw the best results. What happened in that moment? So think back to the last time you taught a class session that made you feel really good, and think about what interaction patterns and what blend of those patterns really helped make that possible. You can see that what we're trying to do here is shift our focus so that we don't only think about the content, which arguably is an important thing to do, but we also think about the interactions that surround that content and really make a learning experience great. The next topic I'd like to talk about in a bit more depth is feedback. I mentioned before that we shift interaction patterns to allow students to seek feedback that they find valuable at a particular time. What I'd like to do now is give you some ways to think about feedback in a more systematic way as well. Here I'm drawing on some research by an education researcher named John Hattie and his colleagues. Over the years, he's had many collaborators. The particular article that I'm referencing here is by John Hattie and Helen Timperley. You can see the citation on the screen, and where you found this video, you'll also find a link to that article. I highly encourage you to take a look at it. It's very helpful. It summarizes years of work by Hattie's group to talk a little bit about what kinds of feedback are there in learning settings and what kind of feedback do students really need. His group has done a pretty impressive job of distilling all of this empirical work into a set of guidelines, and you see those here on the screen. They imagine 3 key feedback questions that recur for students, and those recur at different levels. And so it becomes quite complex, but they break it down into, digestible bits. This makes it a little less intimidating for me, frankly, as a teacher, to try to think about how I'm helping students to answer the questions they might have. So let's begin with the 3 questions on the left here. The first one is an orientation question. Where am I going? What are the goals of what we're up to here? Think about these once more where you are the learner, and think about the last time you tried to learn something and you had a learning resource in front of you. In face-to-face conversations, I often suggest something that seems a little more low stakes so that faculty in particular can think about themselves as learners in non-judgmental ways. For example, let's think about the last time you tried to learn to make a new recipe when you were cooking. Maybe you were asking, well, where am I headed here? And that's a useful conversation when you're scanning the ingredients list and you're looking at the steps that it involves, and you're maybe scanning the picture. Depending on whether you're fixing a formal meal, whether you're preparing food for many people rather than a few people, your goals and what's matching up on that list are going to need to be in sync. Maybe you don't have a lot of time to prepare the recipe, and so something that requires an overnight process is not on the table. So the very first question is simply about, okay, where are we headed with all of this? And is this really what's going to help me get there? That's the first kind of feedback. The second kind is, okay, now that I know where I'm going, how am I going to get there? This is what Hattie and his colleagues call process feedback. And how is the operative word there? And finally, as that becomes clear, as the pathway for the learner becomes more obvious and they begin to form both a mental picture and a conceptual understanding of where they're going and how they're going to get there, they naturally look ahead to where they're headed next. Where do I go next? Or where can I go from here? If we go back to our example of preparing a recipe, I might be thinking, okay, so when do I put this on the table? How long does it need to rest? Do I have to serve it right away? Can I prepare it ahead so that I have time to talk with my guests before we sit down to eat? Or is this the kind of thing where I have to prepare the food and serve it really quickly right afterwards? So they're kind of revisiting in the reflective mode those goals they had, and they're trying to understand, okay, what apart from just getting the recipe executed well, how is this going to fit into my life beyond that? So those are the three feedback questions. Now, Hattie says something really interesting here before I get into the levels, which make all of these things a little bit more complex. It becomes a multivariate problem very quickly. That amounts to me to a bold claim, and that is an ideal learning environment occurs when both teachers and students seek answers to each of these questions. Where am I going? How am I going? And where to next? Think about your own experience as a teacher preparing class materials. How do you help students answer those questions? Where would students look for that kind of feedback? What opportunities do you give them to seek it, and from whom? Are they able to talk to one another? Do you sanction that, or does that happen without your knowing about it? Are they able to ask you or someone else about those things? That is, seek expert feedback in some way? Are there other materials that you prepare? Maybe a video like this one, maybe some readings. Let's turn our attention now to the other side of the screen and the four levels. These levels reflect something of a hierarchy for Hattie and Timperley in that they go from, at the first level, the task level, the most instrumental, the most pragmatic, to, at level 4, the most introspective and sort of far-reaching. What Hattie and Timperley encourage us to do as instructors and folks who are trying to create effective learning experiences is to apply each of the three questions on the left to each level. So with regard to getting the task done that we've assigned students to do, where am I going, how am I going, and where to next should be very clear. So I think about level 1, the task level, and the feedback questions as existing pretty clearly on the assignment sheet or project description. That's where the task level feedback ideally works. And then maybe a bit of Q&A on the first day when I introduce a project. At the process level, we may need to stretch that out in time. Let's imagine that the process involves doing some problems at home. So I may introduce the task, teach them how to do the process, and explain it in class, working on the level 1 questions. But then once they leave, they may, and I may actually want them to start questioning how pieces of the process fit together. Maybe their dependencies, maybe one step and its execution really conditions what happens next. So I've introduced some interesting problems to make them think carefully about that, to raise some questions as well as just practice a routine. If I've done that, I also want to ask myself, where will they get this process level feedback? That is, where will they be able to ask the 3 feedback questions about the process that they're trying to learn? Maybe they will go to a learning center on campus and get some tutoring support. Maybe they'll come to a study session for the course. Maybe in a lecture course, they'll go to recitation where they're breaking out into smaller groups and working together with other peers. That process level feedback from peers is especially valuable. I want to linger there for a second because it affords quick and easy feedback that confirms that the way that someone is orienting towards a task and the way that they're proceeding is either on pace, or maybe it's often needs a little bit of course correction. Here, let me give you a visual image of a learning environment, and that's a dance class. So let's imagine that in level 1, I've shown my students an 8-bar dance step sequence. And then I've asked them to very slowly and without the music, with just clapping along, to step through that sequence with one another. What I notice about my learners in that moment, if I look around the dance studio, is they're answering the 3 feedback questions not by looking at me at the front of the room clapping, but by looking at each other. They're watching to see who's on the right step, if they're pointing their toe, right? I can then give feedback to the whole group by encouraging folks, by giving small nudges, but most of the course correction and what I think of as peer calibration feedback that helps them answer these 3 questions is happening among one another. And that's a very powerful thing. Levels 3 and 4 kind of go together. Self-regulation level is what Hattie and Timperley referred to as the sort of inner drive that students apply. How do they know when to keep going and when to give up? When to seek out additional help? How do they keep themselves optimistic about their success? And this has to do with the effort that they're applying, right? So level 4 goes a little bit of a step deeper, and this is really how they think of themselves. So this is the level at which you're saying, I am bad at math, or I'm not too bad at this. Maybe I'm a good writer after all, or I don't think of myself as a great dancer. I'm clumsy. Versus, wow, I could be a dancer. I'm dancing. Look at me. These are challenging ways to give, challenging questions to provide ways to get feedback for. There's no question about it. But this is why I like to really use this tool to think through very carefully around my various learning goals, how I'm helping students to adjust to these questions. Let's linger on the self-regulation one for a minute. One of the things that I've taught over the course of my career is writing, and I teach the kind of writing, let's say grant writing and technical writing, that folks don't necessarily identify with at the self level. That is, and it's not creative writing where they imagine themselves to be a poet. They're not relating to the task in quite that way. And yet, if they're going to get better at that kind of writing, I need them to stick with it, and I need them to practice more than one time. One time through anything is not likely to make someone radically better at that thing. And so I need them to practice over and over again, like they might if they were identifying with that task on a more personal level. And so the self-regulation piece for me is very, very important. I will often try to give my students, in that case, cues. The way I do that is I will monitor the kinds of challenges that I see the writers facing and elevate the most common ones. And I'll say to the class, I see that we're all struggling, or many of us are struggling with this. Let's acknowledge that that's kind of a tough problem. Now let's look among us and see who seems to be handling that problem especially well. If I've done a peer review exercise, I can even elevate what I call a peer exemplar, someone that the class themselves has praised as having done that thing well. And we can look carefully and say, let's see what there is to emulate here. How might we all practice in this same way? This is self-regulation feedback because it encourages them to go back and try something that they've struggled with and keep at it, to make repetitions where they might be otherwise tempted to stop. Let's think about an example now. I mentioned before, we're going to put our ideas together. These interaction patterns can be combined in powerful ways. And we can think about them as helping students to address these key feedback questions at various levels. So the example I'd like to talk with you about is one that I think of as the secret weapon for elementary school teachers. It's called Think, Pair, Share. So this is a pattern where we ask students to think carefully about something. Maybe they write about it for a short time. Maybe they read about it. And they collect their own thoughts. Then we put them in a small group, or maybe a pair, a dyad, and we say, share your ideas with one other person. This helps them clarify and orient towards the task a little bit. It also allows them to practice framing what they think in a coherent way. And then, once we've done that, we turn to that large group discussion moment to share out what they've learned. So think, pair, share occurs everywhere. Odds are, if you've done a workshop recently, or maybe in your own classroom, you've used the pattern. You might not have called it this, think, pair, share, but now you have a name for it. So why do we use think, pair, share, and why is it so effective? Well, it allows learners often to move through all the feedback questions at all the levels of abstraction, 1, 2, 3, and 4, when it's used well. One of the things that emerges from this is the notion that giving feedback, not just receiving it, is a valuable experience. I think of giving feedback and seeing someone else, seeing their eyes light up as they understand something that you've explained. That's really powerful for helping the giver understand in a self-regulating and even a self-reflective way that they understand this concept, that they've moved a little bit closer to mastery of something because they see one of their peers benefiting from something that they've said. This confidence comes from a performance, right? But it also acts as feedback to them. So giving, I have a name for this, by the way. I call this the giver's gain. This experience of cascading all the way through the levels by describing a process and helping someone else get better at that process. I've not only oriented towards the task and verified that I know what we're doing, I've also solidified my grasp on the process, level 2. I've primed myself and someone else to stay with it practice again, and even to enjoy maybe moving from practice to something like rehearsal, doing it over again. And finally, I may even get to that level where one of those learners, and maybe both, feels better about themselves in relation to that process, having talked to each other. All of that happens without the teacher necessarily looming over. So that's the value and the real transformative power of a pattern like Think, Pair, Share. And there are other patterns like this, but this is just the one I wanted you to think about because it's so common. On the screen here, I've put some quotes that represent things that students might say in a Think, Pair, Share kind of moment. See if you can categorize these bits of feedback as to where they would fall. Are they answering one of the feedback questions that Hattie and his colleagues have posed? And if they are, at what level? Level 1, 2, 3, or 4? Give that a try. Once you feel like you have some grasp of these concepts, your interaction patterns, which are your building blocks, and the types of feedback that students may need to feel successful, we're ready to apply these by redesigning a learning activity. So this is an informal moment, but if it was more formal, I might assign this as the homework. I don't imagine that it's something that you can do quickly or easily, but it's something that will really help you grasp how important the interactions that you want to have in your classroom are to the activity of learners. So here goes. Choose an activity, one that you can name a clear outcome for, a set of learning goals perhaps, and something that you ask learners to do in your class. And what I want you to do is compare the typical interaction sequence that you ask learners to engage in. So this is how you usually do it. And apply all of this vocabulary to it. What interaction patterns do you use? What feedback opportunities do you create? And be honest with yourself. Do you hit them all? If you do, move on. Let's find one where you don't. Oh, and congratulations, by the way. Once you find one that you think you could do a better job at creating more feedback opportunities, or perhaps change up the interaction patterns in a different way, now set about redesigning that activity to be sure that your learners can seek answers. Here is where that set of questions and the levels becomes a kind of checklist for yourself. It's a challenge to do this, no question about it. As you go along, make a list about what needs to change. What would have to happen if you were really going to now deliver this revised activity? Would you need to change rooms? We talked about physical constraints being barriers sometimes. Would you need to change the format? Would you need to prepare ahead of time a little bit differently? What about your teaching practice might change? Would you talk more? Would you talk less? Would you ask students to do something different? Would you maybe use a different online tool? To help you with this task, I've reordered Hattie's information here as a grid. All along in my head, because I'm kind of a visual thinker, and I like matrices like these. This is how I understand these tasks to be related. So on the left side, or on the y-axis here, I have the 3 questions. And on the x-axis across the top, you can see the labels for each level: the task level, the process level, the self-regulation, and the self. Near the top, I've given you another set. This is a bonus set of concepts for activity and the learning goals for that activity. You see the little blue sticky note up there? I think of 4 kinds of learning goals that I often have for each activity. And usually, I don't have all 4 for the same activity. But I might have activities that do 2 of these at a time. So one is gaining skill, practicing a process of some sort. My dance class example is a good example of that. Another is knowledge. This is probably the most common on a college campus, particularly in content areas. We want students to know something different by the time they're finished. We also have attitude and value-oriented learning goals. So let me give you an example of what I mean by attitude. I think about attitude not in the most, colloquial way, as in don't give me attitude, but rather attitude like orientation towards something, like you're shifting the plane's attitude to land. An example I have there when I'm teaching graduate students is I want them to develop an attitude towards research methods that encourages them to match the question with the method that they select, and not just reflexively choose a method or rule out a method for other kinds of reasons. And then value. So value is probably the highest thing, but if we think about, let's say, a science course, not everyone in an introductory science course like biology is going to go on to become a biologist. And so while it's important that they learn some knowledge about biology, we also want them to develop some values about scientific inquiry and the biological sciences. We may want them to value evidence-based reasoning. We may want them to value observation as a means of gaining knowledge rather than simply taking someone's word for it. These are all things that we might use a learning activity like an experiment to help them realize. So in addition to observing the properties of a thing and being able to label those accurately in the knowledge category, we may also want them to, down the road, value that empirical experience so that when they come across a policy issue, they have a different orientation towards that than they otherwise would. So with this grid, you get something like the full picture of what it might look like to design a set of powerful interactions for learning. And we can do that in relation to the content that we're teaching, but also with a focus more on helping students seek the right kind of feedback. When I'm in planning mode, I think about where will students be able to seek answers to each question at each level. So that's what would go in the boxes here. I mentioned before that in the box where am I going and task level feedback interact, and really all of those in that vertical column, I would write something like the assignment sheet. I would hope that that's where I would put a lot of that information. The other thing that this might be useful for, and that I highly recommend, is, and get ready because I'm going to suggest a learning interaction here, is take this grid with you and go observe a colleague teaching. Ask them to pick a day where they're going to be doing something in class that's interesting to you on an interaction level. Then sit in the room, or wherever it might be, and watch what you see. Take some notes using this grid. How did students seek answers to each question at each level? What resources were they using? Once you've done that, schedule some time for coffee with that colleague and talk through it. Talk through what you saw. Point out the things that you want to emulate in your own practice. It's a valuable experience. What we're doing in that moment is taking our own teaching seriously. We're treating our teaching as something that we ourselves can practice and improve. And in doing that, I may have just revealed a learning goal at the attitude and value level for you that I have for all of you. And that is, I want you to take an empirical attitude towards your teaching. And I want you to view it as something that you can get better at. It's not something we're only born knowing how to do. And if we work at it, we can actually create more effective learning experiences consistently well for our students. When we do that, we also value our teaching in a different way. We see it as an important part of the way we share knowledge. Research and publishing are one way we share knowledge at the university. Teaching is another. And we would like to value that co-equally with our research mission. As you're taking time to walk through, I've prepared an example for you. I won't go through all of the answers here, but you can study them if you find them valuable. I hope that you take some of my advice and engage deeply with some of the reflective experiences here, pausing at times to think about your own practice, applying the concepts of interaction styles, interaction modes, and feedback to your own teaching. And I really hope that you take me up on the suggestion to talk with your colleagues, maybe go see them teach, to redesign a course activity of your own, and practice creating these kinds of rich feedback cultures in your own classroom. If you do, give me a shout. You'll see my contact information here, and I'd love to have coffee with you and talk to you about teaching too. Thanks for listening.